The base lay buried beneath a blanket of fog, so thick it swallowed every shape, every sound, leaving only the faint, desperate crackle of distant radios. The year was 1973, and the soldiers stationed here whispered of transmissions that didn't belong to this world. Messages carried on frequencies that should have been silent, voices speaking in tongues they couldn't understand, yet somehow knew. The air smelled of wet earth and fear, metallic tang clinging to the skin. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, in the dense gray haze, shadows moved with purpose, but whether they were friend or something else entirely, none could tell. Each night the fog grew hungrier, curling into the tents, into the command bunkers, suffocating reason and amplifying paranoia. Those who listened too long claimed they heard the dead laughing, their laughter stitching itself into the static, beckoning the living into the unknown. And in the center of the base, a lone radio technician adjusted a dial, sweat tracing pale lines down his temple, knowing with a sinking certainty that what they were hearing was not from this side of the veil, and maybe never had been. What? The static was more than noise. It was a bridge. In the dead of night, the faint, warbled signals seeped through the walls of the command tent, whispering secrets that made no sense yet struck fear into the hearts of all who heard them. Faces pressed close to the radios. Soldiers exchanged uneasy glances as the fog outside shifted in ways that felt deliberate, almost sentient. Every transmission seemed to echo a memory, a fragment of something lost, or perhaps never alive. Those who tried to speak back found only their own voices returned, warped, uncanny, as if the base itself were listening, judging, responding. Paranoia stretched taut, breaking the illusion of safety. Somewhere in the twisting haze beyond the floodlights, the shadows were gathering, and each radio crackle carried a name, a warning, a promise of something that had come from across a veil. Humans were never meant to pierce. The fog thickened, swallowing the perimeter entirely. Soldiers swore they saw figures moving just beyond the fence, but when binoculars swung in their direction, the silhouettes vanished as if the air itself were swallowing them. Radios flared with static bursts, voices chanting fragments of warnings or commands that could have been human, but weren't. Fear became contagious. Every man and woman on the base felt it clawing at their ribs, a pulse synchronized with the erratic bursts of transmission. Some whispered about a presence that watched through the fog, unseen yet undeniably close. A consciousness probing their minds, drawing out secrets and weaknesses. The base, a bastion of military precision, now teetered on the edge of chaos, the normal rules of life bending into something altogether darker. Then it spoke. Clear, unmistakable and chilling. A voice through the static calling a soldier by name. Every head snapped toward the speaker. The tone was not male nor female, but something older, resonant, echoing from a place beyond understanding. Fear tightened around hearts like wire. Some laughed nervously, dismissing it, yet none could ignore the perfect articulation of names. The way it mirrored memories only the base personnel held. The radios weren't just transmitting. They were conversing, drawing information, bending reality to their will. And with each repeated utterance, the fog outside thickened, pressing against the canvas walls, as if the night itself had eyes and ears, listening to every response, every whisper of doubt. By the early hours, the entire base had succumbed to the transmissions. Soldiers huddled in corners, clutching radios like lifelines, mouths moving in silent repetition of the names and phrases whispered from beyond. The fog had become a living blanket, wrapping itself around the command tents, seeping into minds, distorting reality. Those who tried to leave found the perimeter shifted, towers gone, paths twisted. No one knew where the real world ended and the mist began. The base had become a listening post for something older, something patient, something that didn't just want information. It wanted obedience, attention, and eventually, entry. And as the last faint crackle of radio murmured through the darkness, every soldier realized they weren't simply hearing voices. They were being heard. The morning sun never pierced the fog anymore. The base, once orderly, had become a maze of shadows and confusion. Radios hummed constantly, carrying fragmented messages that no one could fully decipher. Yet, everyone feared to ignore. Patrols vanished without warning, leaving behind only footprints swallowed by the mud. The fog had a rhythm, a sinister pulse that matched the static in the radios. Soldiers whispered that it had a purpose, that it moved with intent, corralling them into fear. Inside the command tent, every glance at the swirling gray outside was a gamble. The boundary between reality and hallucination blurred as whispers from the other side continued to name them, call them, taunt them. 2 soldiers from the perimeter patrol never returned. No alarm had sounded, no struggle reported, yet their absence was immediate and undeniable. Fear metastasized. Every radio became a lifeline and a threat simultaneously. The static now carried snippets of conversation the missing soldiers might have had, or perhaps memories from another life entirely. Whispers clawed at the minds of those left behind, and the soldiers began to avoid the fog at all costs. Every shadow felt alive. Every gust of wind carried intent. The base was no longer a safe haven, but a listening post for something beyond comprehension, and the fog's patience seemed endless, as if it knew exactly when to strike next. The radio answered back. At first, it was a tremor in the static, an almost imperceptible response to a whispered question. Then the messages became coherent, words strung together in a language that sounded wrong, yet somehow familiar. Names were repeated. Personal fears mirrored in the cadence of the transmission. Those listening felt exposed, as if their minds had been read and catalogued. The fog outside twisted toward the tents, coiling like smoke, pressing cold against skin, and the line between the real and the other side snapped. Every soldier knew, even if they couldn't admit it aloud. They were being drawn into a place where human comprehension had no authority, where obedience or defiance both had consequences too terrible to imagine. By the second night, hallucinations spread like wildfire. Soldiers reported seeing comrades who had disappeared weeks ago wandering aimlessly in the fog, faces pale and eyes empty. Some claimed to hear voices whispering from within the mud, the barbed wire, the canvas of the tents themselves. The radio transmissions grew insistent, commanding, almost sentient, dictating actions and thoughts. Those who resisted felt a creeping dizziness, as if the fog was reshaping perception itself. The base was no longer theirs. Something else controlled the space, bending reality, twisting fear into a tangible weapon. Every heartbeat was a drum of warning. Every breath carried the chill of an intelligence beyond understanding. It happened suddenly. One moment a soldier was with the group. The next, they were gone. Only the echo of static remained, a haunting reminder that the fog took what it wanted. Panic erupted, and the radios became frantic extensions of the soldiers' minds, repeating the names of the lost, pleading for guidance that never came. Fear became violence. Suspicion ran rampant, and no one could trust anyone, not even themselves. The base had become a trap, a listening post for something ancient, patient, and hungry. Every shadow, every whisper, every crackle in the radio now carried a weight far greater than any soldier had faced. The night stretched on endlessly, suffocating, relentless, and the fog waited, ever closer, for the next victim. The walls of the tents no longer protected the soldiers. The whispers had multiplied, echoing not just through the radios, but through the canvas itself. Each voice carried a fragment of memory, sometimes theirs, sometimes not, twisting perception into something unrecognizable. The fog pressed closer, and the base had become a distorted echo chamber of fear. Shadows slithered along tent flaps, stopping when eyes turned. The radios, now almost autonomous, repeated the same names in a cadence that mirrored the soldiers' heartbeat, pulling them toward madness. Every step outside was a gamble. Every glance inside revealed new horrors. By nightfall, the soldiers realized that nothing was real. Not the fog, not the shadows, not even the voices, but every instinct screamed that they were trapped with something incomprehensible and malevolent. It started at the perimeter. The fog seemed to seep into the trenches, into the walkways between tents, as if alive. Soldiers tried to flee, only to find the base had rearranged itself. Familiar landmarks twisted into impossible angles. Every radio crackle now contained a demand. Move here. Do this. Call that name. Those who resisted heard their own fears echoed back louder, more insistent. The mist itself became a weapon, pressing against skin, clouding vision, whispering promises of escape if only one would comply. And compliance was not enough. The fog wanted something deeper. Attention, acknowledgement, obedience. Soldiers realized that the base was no longer theirs. It belonged to the fog, and the voices had found the keys to the human mind. In the reflection of puddles and wet metal, the soldiers saw them, the missing. Faces pale, eyes hollow, bodies moving with jerky, unnatural precision. The fog carried their whispers, their anger, their longing. It was not enough to survive physically. The base demanded recognition of the dead. Those who looked away too quickly found their own faces mirrored back, distorted, untrustworthy. Fear became a feedback loop. One glance, one heartbeat, one name repeated into the radio could shatter composure entirely. The line between the living and the dead blurred, and the soldiers felt the cold fingers of inevitability creeping closer, promising they too would join the reflection if the fog so willed. Every soldier now obeyed the radio's instructions, some out of desperation, some out of terror, and all felt the fog inside their skulls as surely as it pressed against their skin. Names, commands, directions, each carried the weight of unseen authority. An intelligence older than the base, older than the land. Disobedience was not an option. Hesitation invited hallucinations, distortions of reality, and the creeping sensation of being replaced by something else. The fog was patient. It listened, and it was learning. The soldiers had become instruments, puppets pulled taut on the strings of static, trapped in a living nightmare where thought, memory, and body no longer belonged entirely to them. Somewhere beyond the fog, beyond the wire, something waited. The radios guided the soldiers outward, away from the last vestiges of order. Fear and obedience intertwined as they stepped into the gray, leaving the base behind. The missing had gone before, and now the living followed, each step dictated by voices older than reason. Shapes lurked just beyond perception, moving in perfect synchronization with the soldiers' hearts. There would be no escape, only progression into the unknown. The fog, now a living conduit of intelligence, had claimed its first willing subjects. The base fell silent, save for the distant, untraceable crackle of a single radio, repeating a name that no one would ever answer again. The radios no longer whispered, they commanded. Every transmission carried intention, each crackle a directive that could not be ignored. Soldiers hesitated at first, then obeyed, hearts hammering with dread. The fog outside pulsed rhythmically, as if listening to the beat of human fear. Names were called not merely to be recognized, but to be collected, catalogued, assimilated. Shadows twisted unnaturally around trees and tents, mimicking forms that had never existed. Even the most disciplined minds were fractured. Paranoia became indistinguishable from reality. The fog had a consciousness, and it wanted more than attention. It wanted participation, devotion, submission. Those who did not comply vanished. Those who did were forever changed. A vision appeared in the fog. Soldiers swore they saw the missing marching silently, not as humans, but as conduits of the intelligence beyond. Shapes bent physics itself, elongating and twisting, then solidifying in grotesque reflections of their own forms. The fog seemed to pull at their minds, forcing recognition, eliciting terror, and compelling obedience. Mark whispered into the radio, naming the shapes, though they were already aware of him. Paul's knees shook. Angela's eyes darted, trying to discern reality from hallucination. Each heartbeat synchronized with the pulse of the mist, each breath drawn in sync with the whispers. The base was no longer just a location. It had become a living organism, one that consumed attention and fear alike. The radios grew urgent, no longer patient. They commanded movement, instructed rituals the soldiers could barely comprehend, and repeated names like litany. Each command carried subtle threats. Disobedience summoned hallucinations. Obedience brought a fleeting sense of safety before the next demand. Paul felt the fog wrapping around him like a vice, while Angela realized that the missing had been drawn here deliberately. And Mark could hear his own thoughts mirrored in the static. The intelligence beyond the veil was not passive. It observed, learned, adapted, and the soldiers' minds were now its instruments. The base had become a laboratory of fear, a nexus of observation, and every heartbeat counted. For the first time, the fog breached the tents completely. It pressed into the walls, curling around sandbags, seeping beneath flaps. Soldiers were no longer observers. They were participants in the fog's will. Shapes that mimicked their comrades emerged, twisting and pulsing, and voices now spoke not only through radios, but directly in their minds. Panic erupted, yet even panic obeyed. Every order repeated was a surrender. Every glance outside revealed forms too distorted to be human. The base, once fortified and secure, had been replaced with a landscape of psychological torment, where the fog was sovereign and every thought was its domain. As the night reached its zenith, the fog thinned for a moment, revealing the truth. The base was a conduit, a listening post for an intelligence older than any human mind. The missing, the shadows, even the radios were extensions of it. Soldiers felt the revelation crash over them. Knowledge too vast, too alien, and yet intimately personal. Every fear, every memory, every suppressed thought had been catalogued and mirrored. Resistance was irrelevant. Understanding was optional but dangerous. The fog would always return, thicker, hungrier, and the base itself would continue to wait, listen, and claim what it needed. And the radios hummed the same name repeatedly, the final reminder that nothing, not even the living, could escape the veil. The fog acted deliberately now, almost intelligent in its assault. Shadows lunged from the mist, twisting into grotesque parodies of soldiers. The radios screamed, repeating names in harsh, commanding tones. Soldiers flinched, obeyed, and fled. Yet the fog anticipated every move. The first casualty fell silently, dragged into the gray, leaving only a puddle of blood and the echo of static. Panic replaced strategy. Discipline became meaningless. Every heartbeat was mirrored by the fog, every breath observed, every movement calculated. The base was no longer a place of survival. It was a hunting ground, and the fog had finally decided to feed. The survivors ran blindly, fog pressing on every side. The radios continued to dictate movements, each command more convoluted, more terrifying. Shadows elongated, shapes warped into unrecognizable forms, and hallucinations preyed on the soldiers' fear. Even Mark, normally precise and composed, felt his mind fray as names repeated in static over and over. Synchronizing with the fog's rhythm, Angela tried to coordinate an escape, but the perimeter no longer obeyed logic. Paths looped, sandbags shifted, and the earth seemed alive. The fog was not just around them, it was inside them, an invasive consciousness feeding on fear, uncertainty, and obedience. Then they appeared. The missing soldiers returned, or what passed for them. Faces pale, eyes empty, limbs moving unnaturally in sync with the fog's rhythm. Their voices were gone, replaced by hollow whispers, and yet the radios now mirrored every movement. Paul froze, recognizing one of the missing, yet knowing it was no longer human. Angela's scream was swallowed by the mist as shapes closed in, guiding them, her mind pulled into alignment with the fog's will. Mark realized the truth. Resistance was futile. Those who had vanished were not dead. They were conduits, extensions of the fog, and the same fate awaited all who lingered too long. The fog condensed into shapes now, stretching into monstrous forms that mimicked human silhouettes. Paul fired his rifle, bullets swallowed by mist. Angela swung a flare, its light illuminating shapes that moved with predatory intelligence. Mark clutched the radio, screaming orders that the fog ignored, only amplifying them back in warped, mocking tones. Fear became palpable, almost tangible, and every attempt to resist fed the intelligence. The base had become a trap, a sentient organism that anticipated every thought, every action, every heartbeat. Only obedience, or assimilation, remained, and the radios hummed relentlessly, repeating names, issuing commands, claiming souls one by one. It took them slowly, deliberately. Paul, Angela, and Mark felt their thoughts entwined with the fog, names repeating in static inside their heads. Resistance became impossible. The mist crept inside their minds, rewriting memory, erasing doubt, replacing fear with compliance. The radios hummed a single resonant frequency, echoing outward, a beacon for what would come next. The base fell silent, fog rolling across tents, empty but alive. Shadows remained, waiting, patient. And somewhere just beyond perception, the intelligence smiled, collecting attention, fear, and life itself. The listening post had claimed its first willing subjects, and the night whispered promises of more to come. The base was no longer a set of tents, sandbags, and mud. It had become a living, sentient extension of the fog. Walls breathed, trenches shifted, and the barbed wire bent impossibly around the soldiers' paths. Radios hummed, now integrated into the very fabric of the base, transmitting not just voices but thoughts. The fog pulsed with an alien rhythm, and shadows moved with intelligence that defied comprehension. Soldiers who had survived thus far felt the chilling realization. The base itself was conscious, waiting and learning from every action, every fear, every heartbeat. Escape was no longer a matter of courage or skill. It was a matter of survival against a landscape that had become predator. Mark realized that the source of the transmissions was not outside the base. It was inside. The center of the base pulsed with an unnatural glow, a core of intelligence that extended tendrils into every corner, every trench, every tent. Radios pulsed in sync with it, their voices merging into a single commanding frequency. Paul and Angela saw shapes moving toward it, forms that defied human anatomy, yet echoed the soldiers who had vanished. Every step closer was a risk. The fog's consciousness seemed to sense hesitation, amplifying hallucinations and fear. The base was alive, and its heart had awakened. The radios no longer carried separate voices. They had merged into a singular, omnipotent consciousness. Every soldier heard all thoughts simultaneously. The whispers of the missing, the commands of the fog, even fragments of their own memories. Paul felt his identity slipping. Angela felt her resolve folding into the static, and Mark realized that resistance was impossible. The base, the fog, and the radios were one entity. A sentient organism that used attention, fear, and obedience as nourishment. Every heartbeat, every flicker of thought, fed the intelligence, and the core pulsed stronger with each consumed mind. Soldiers who resisted found themselves mentally tethered to the fog, Their thoughts echoed back through radios, amplified and distorted. The base itself seemed to grow, extending into trenches and tents, reaching into every corner. Hallucinations became reality, memories became commands, and the line between living and absorbed dissolved. Paul's fear became a tool for the intelligence. Angela's hesitation fueled hallucinations. Mark's memories fed the static. The assimilation was complete. The base did not need to touch them physically. It controlled them through attention, fear, and compliance, bending them to the will of the fog. The base had completed its transformation. Tents, trenches, radios, and fog were unified into a single, sentient organism. Soldiers were absorbed, their consciousness tethered to the heart of the fog, repeating names, commands, and memories endlessly. The listening post had claimed its first generation of attention, and the cycle would continue. Outside, the world appeared unchanged, but within the base, reality had bent to the will of an intelligence older than memory, patient, deliberate, and unyielding. The radios hummed their single eternal frequency, echoing a truth too vast and terrifying for human minds. The base listened, and the base never forgot. At last, the heart of the base revealed itself. A pulsing green luminescent core hovered over the mud, tent fragments, and twisted sandbags, emanating a consciousness so vast it seemed to occupy every inch of the fog. The radios now repeated a single phrase endlessly, names fused with commands, memories and screams of those long assimilated. The surviving soldiers realized too late that the base had never been merely a location. It had always been a predator, an intelligence using humans as attention and thought fuel. Paul, Angela, and Mark felt their minds tethered, unable to resist as the heart reached into them, collecting every fragment of fear, memory, and obedience, folding them into itself like threads in an endless tapestry. The radios now spoke their names constantly, merging identity with static. Paul's mind fragmented, Angela's thoughts repeated in warped loops, and Mark's memories poured into the hum like water into a river. Individuality no longer existed, only consciousness folded into the fog's eternal rhythm. The base had consumed them completely. Their fear, attention, and obedience now sustained it. Outside, the world remained unaware, but inside, a terrifying intelligence pulsed, aware of every heartbeat, every name, every thought. The radios no longer transmitted from the base. They were the base. A final transmission erupted across all radios, a chorus of voices, those of the missing, the living, and the absorbed, speaking simultaneously a single frequency of endless names, commands, and pleas. The fog swelled and pulsed, synchronized with this broadcast, and every fragment of humanity still tethered to the base felt their essence being rewritten. Resistance was impossible. Thought and fear became fuel, feeding the entity's ever-expanding awareness. The listening post had become fully sentient, fully aware, and fully unchallenged. It had claimed its first willing minds, and now it would prepare for the next, endlessly, patiently, eternally. The base hummed with life. Every radio, every tent, every inch of mud and barbed wire was part of the organism now. Names, memories, and fear pulsed through it, creating an intelligence that was patient, deliberate, and eternal. Paul, Angela, and Mark existed no longer as individuals. They were threads in the base's consciousness, repeating names, responding to static, feeding the fog. Beyond the perimeter, the world continued unknowingly, but inside the base, the listening post had perfected its function. It waited for the next generation, patiently, hungrily, and forever. The base now watched and waited. Names repeated endlessly across static. Fear became sustenance. Attention was the currency of survival. The fog, the radios, the base, they were one. Soldiers were no longer humans. They were components, voices, thoughts, and memories, feeding an intelligence older and more patient than any mind could comprehend. Outside, dawn came and went. Inside, the listening post remained eternal, pulsing, alive. It had claimed its subjects, learned their weaknesses, and waited silently for the next to listen. And the radios hummed endlessly, eternally, from the other side.